Hi guys, this is the second video for the exchange rates, and I'm going to talk about the consequences of changes in exchange rates on our three macroeconomic goals, living standards, and the current account. So the best way to think about this is if you think about the exchange rate as an aggregate demand or aggregate supply side factor, you can manipulate the AD-AS diagram and draw really clear conclusions to the macroeconomic goals. So, for example, if you treated the exchange rate as an aggregate demand side factor and you apply the thinking of changes in purchasing power, you can make really clear links to the AD equation and you're able to shift the curve. So let's have a look at this one. If we assume there's an appreciation of the Aussie dollar, it means that Aussies enjoy higher purchasing power, which should lead to more imports. The flip side of that is trading partners unfortunately suffer a decrease in their purchasing power, so we should see a decrease in exports. So an increase in M plus a decrease in X is going to lead to a decrease in aggregate demand, which shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left, as you can see on this graph. And so what we see here is overall there's going to be deflationary or disinflationary pressure, that decrease in the inflation rate, which we can link to price stability. We see a decrease in the output of goods and services, which is a decrease in real GDP, which we can link to strong and sustainable economic growth. And the byproduct of that is we should see an increase in unemployment, which we can then link to our goal of full employment. So it's not really the case you're ever going to need to speak to multiple outcomes. But if you apply the thinking of, hang on, exchange rates are an AD factor, I can then manipulate this graph. You can then draw really clear conclusions to your goals. This is the same story going in the opposite direction. If we assume a depreciation of the Aussie dollar, we see a decrease in the purchasing power for Aussies, which leads to a decrease in imports. At the same time, our trading partners enjoy higher purchasing power, which leads to an increase in exports. And so an increase in X plus a decrease in M is going to increase aggregate demand overall. It's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. And then we can see there's going to be an increase in inflation, an increase in output, a decrease in unemployment. Draw the conclusions against your various macroeconomic goals. The flip side of this thinking is that exchange rates are also an aggregate supply side factor. So if you're a producer in Australia and, for example, there is an appreciation of the Aussie dollar, that's really good news for you because you can now buy more goods and services from overseas to be used as inputs in the production process. So an increase in Australia's purchasing power leads to a decrease in the cost of production for those producers who rely on imports in the production process, and that should lead to an increase in aggregate supply. We see that shift to the right of the aggregate supply curve. And once again, team, we can see deflation or disinflationary pressure, increase in output, decrease in unemployment. There are those links to those domestic macroeconomic goals. And once again, this is the same story and opposite, except we've got a depreciation of the Aussie dollar that decreases Australia's purchasing power. That's not great for Aussie producers that rely on imports in the production process. We're going to see an increase in the cost of production and a decrease in AS. And so we have all the opposite outcomes. We have an increase in inflation, a decrease in output, and an increase in unemployment. So using the exchange rate as an AD or an AS factor gives you really clear links to the goals. Top tip, don't do them both. Don't treat it as an AS and an AD factor and shift multiple curves at the same time. Commit to one story and tell it well. Guys, finally, I want to speak about the impact to the current account. So I'm going to be using the terms export credit, import debit, just like we did when we looked at the balance of payments. And again, it's all got to do with exports and imports changing because of changes in purchasing power. So let's say there was an appreciation of the Aussie dollar. We know that leads to a decrease in the purchasing power for Australian trading partners. So we should see a decrease in exports and a decrease in export credits. So that's a decrease in money flowing into the current account. And then the opposite is true for imports. So if we've got an appreciation of the Aussie dollar, we should see an increase in the purchase of imports because we now enjoy higher purchasing power. We should see an increase in import debits. So a decrease in export credits plus an increase in import debits. A decrease in export credits plus an increase in import debits, that's going to lead to a decrease in our current account surplus. So an appreciation of the Aussie dollar, which you might think is a great thing, is actually not a very positive influence on our current account surplus. And then the whole opposite story is true. If we have a depreciation of the Aussie dollar, it means that our trading partners enjoy higher purchasing power. We should see greater demand for our exports, which translates to higher export credits. The flip side of that is the depreciation leads to a decrease in the purchasing power for Australians, which leads to a decrease in the purchase of imports, which leads to a decrease in import debits. So we have more money coming in and less money going out in the form of an increase in export credits and a decrease in import debits. So we should see an improvement in the current account surplus. So an appreciation is actually a positive thing for our current account. So a lot of information, obviously go back and listen to it as you need to, but always thinking, how do changes in exchange rates influence purchasing power? And then from there, what's their impact on imports and exports? Because that's where you can funnel it through to aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and the current account. And by extension of that, everybody, if you are then able to link it to access to goods and services, you can make a really clear link to material living standards. I hope that makes sense.